guys remember how it goes? Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan et kol darkav la'amo Yisrael kartov niot lekol hadevarim Shabbat Shamayim. Blessed are you, Lord our God, everlasting King, who has given all his ways to his people Israel as picture of all things heavenly.
Shabbat Shalom. Good morning. Rabbi and Eileen are out of town, so I'm pinch hitting. This will be a first for me. I'm going to teach on the Parsha portion. He's from me, yeah, right. Which is Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. Coming from a Christian background, I think I don't know how common it is, but pretty much every Christian I ever knew, we never really paid attention to this book. We never really read through it. Wasn't really taught on much. It was kind of ignored, as most of the Jew things were in the Christian church. And it was kind of looked upon as bloody and gory and gross when you really read through what they did. You know, ripping guts out and throwing blood everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but, you know. And plus the whole idea that's prevalent in the Christian church of, oh, well, that was for the Jews, and that was under the law, and that was back then, and that's not for us. We don't do that anymore because we got a new covenant, and we don't need that anymore. Which, I mean, regardless of whether or not that there's actually a temple that we can't do it, but that really wasn't the focus of why it seemed to be ignored so much. And so I never really paid much attention to it. And in the majority of the thought that I had been taught and heard about was that, you know, the sacrifices were, you know, basically just for sin. You know, and Jesus did that and died for us, and so we don't need that anymore. So it was, you know, a huge misconception. This parsha is, it's called Vayikra, which is, and he called, referring to God himself calling to Moses. And it consists of the first 5 books of Leviticus, which is the central book of the Torah, the 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's right in the middle. And it starts off, then the Lord called to Moshe and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of animals from the herd of the flock. And then it goes on to talk about the process, what you're to do, etc., etc. And each of the first 5 chapters of Leviticus each deals with a certain offering. The olah, the burnt offering, which is basically to connect with God, to express generosity, spiritual elevation. The mincha, which is a meal or grain offering, which is a free will gift to God. The shlaim, a peace offering, or for well-being and happy occasions. The chatat, the sin offering, which is atonement and purging of accidental and unintentional sin. And the asham, which is a guilt offering, which is done after you've repaired the damage and made the innocent party whole again. I don't really like to use the word sacrifice And this wasn't, I kind of read about this, did a lot of studying from a lot of different sources, as opposed to the term offering, because sacrifice kind of connotates and implies you give up something, you lose something. It subtracts from you. And that's really not the whole idea of what this is about. It's about adding to us drawing near to God, getting intimacy with Him. That's not a negative thing at all. It's not even anywhere close to the concept of sacrifice, the way mostly we think about that. And that's really the whole goal of what this is about, is for us to draw close to God. I mean, when you think back about the first man, Adam, and his wife Hava in the garden, God was there and walked around in the garden with him. You couldn't get any more intimate than that. I mean, they just hung out together. I mean, that's intimacy. And that all got lost over hundreds and thousands of years. And so this was a way of restoring that, of God extending that invitation, going, hey, let's bring that back. And this is how we do it. And if you think about it, the offerings, they've been around since way before this tabernacle. I mean, there was offerings in the garden from Adam. Noah made offerings, his sons made offerings. So the whole idea of sacrifices and offerings wasn't just instituted here. It'd been around since forever, since the very beginning, and transmuted through the oral Torah and passed on from generation to generation as to how that's done. And then here it's just where it's codified and written down and given to the nation as a whole. And it starts off and it says, God called from the tabernacle. The Shekinah, the glory of God, covered the tabernacle. And it said that it was so great that not even Moshe could go into the tent. And it says that in Exodus 40:35. And the sages say that only Moshe could hear God calling him, as opposed to Mount Sinai, when the Torah was given, everybody heard the voice of God. The thunder and the rumblings and all the noise. In this instance, when God called Moshe, he called just Moshe. It was as if he was whispering in his ear. And he was the only one that could hear him call. And he called to him from within the tent. He was inside there. And he said, hey, come, listen. And it said that even though the voice of God is, loud enough to split trees, Moshe was really the only one worthy to hear the voice. And it's also said that was because he was humble. He was one of the humblest men. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. And what God was calling Moshe to was a set-apart life, to live separately to God, devoted to God, intimately with Him. And that's what really we're all called to. And this instruction was for the entire nation, not just Moshe individually, but he was the one to transmit it to them. So he was calling him for a set-apart life. And that's what the Vayikra really is. It's a cry out in intimacy. It's a personal invitation. And that's, like that you would summon someone that you're in love with. Like a husband might call out to his wife, or a wife to the husband. It's that type of calling, not a general overall announcement to the whole nation, which is less intimate and more in general. So it was a very personal thing between God and Moshe. In Vayikra or Leviticus, it's this, like I say, it's the central book of the Torah. It's the heart of the Torah. It's right in the middle. And it's interesting that if you look at the Torah scroll and some of the Siddur and the Tanakh that are written in Hebrew, the word Vayikra ends in the letter Aleph. And sometimes in the Torah, certain letters are emphasized because they're larger or they're smaller. Like Bereshit 1:1, in the very beginning, the Beit is very large. And in this instance, the last Aleph in Vayikra is very small, in most of the time when it's written, not always, but many times. And when that's done, there's a reason behind it. And it's said from the sages that the reason the Aleph is small is because of the humility of Moshe, that he was, the humblest man on earth, and he was calling Moshe.
Is there any vowels underneath the Aleph?
Well, in the Torah, there are no vowels.
Right, but if you read out the word, would there be a vowel underneath there?
I didn't hear you.
Would there be one?
Would there be one?
Yeah.
Well, there's punctuation marks that show you how to pronounce it in some of the other times that it's written, but not the actual Torah scrolls. The Torah scrolls don't ever have any punctuation now. But when you see it in bound books, it'll have that in there, yeah. It'll tell you how to pronounce it, if that was the question. And so it represents Moshe's humility, which it says in Numbers 12:3, that he was the most humblest man on earth. And the Aleph represents I, myself, ani, the word ani, me. And in Moshe's mind, he didn't really have that sense of himself. So it was like he didn't have the ego involved. That wasn't an issue with him because he was so humble. Because ego and humility are pretty much opposites. And even in Exodus 32:32, if we read there, it says, "But now, if you will, forgive their sin, and if not, please blot out me from your book, which you have written." So he wasn't even thinking of himself. He was just like, look, if you're going to get rid of the whole nation, then do it. But don't even consider me in the equation. So like I say, he didn't really have that sense of ego and myself when it came to his relationship with God. And the book Vayikra and Leviticus, the entire book of Vayikra, it's instructions for offerings, or korbanot, the plural of korban. And it goes into detail about them. And if we look at chapter 1 deals with the burnt offering. Chapter 2 is the mincha. Chapter 3 is the shlamim, and then chatat and asham. And each of the offerings have differentiations in them. And many of them you could bring a bull, or you could bring a sheep, or you could bring a goat or a ram. So there's different ways, and I think, I didn't check into it, but if I remember right from previous studies, part of the reasoning for that is that, if you couldn't afford a bull, you could bring a sheep. If you can't afford a sheep, you can bring a goat, that kind of a thing. And then there was one of them where you brought a bird. If you can't bring two birds, you bring one bird, this or that. And so even there was grace, the grace of God, which is really what's being extended here, is, his mercy. The same thing with the grain offerings. There was different ways you could prepare the grain offerings, so I'm not sure what the differences were there. I'll have to look into that. But there's a lot to be learned from that, and there's a lot more that we could kind of dig into. I would encourage you to do that on your own. And the word korban, which is where korban or offerings comes from, means to draw near to God. And like I said, the invitation wasn't, it was initially in verse 1 just given directly to Moshe, but by extension, the invitation was to the entire camp of Israel, all of Bnei Israel, because that's the whole gist of why God called them out from among the nations, was to have a people he could call his own, to have an intimate relationship with. And it's to live a holy life, a set-apart life, as a kingdom of priests and kings and priests. And Vayikra, the whole book of Leviticus, is how to do that, because these people didn't know how to do that. They'd been living their own pagan ways for generations, and they'd strayed from the way that they were first told from their forefathers how to live. And so God's trying to correct all that and bring them back and go, hey, no, if we're going to live in a relationship, it's got to be this way. My house, my rules kind of a thing, which kind of makes sense. And the idea is to, separate yourself from what you had been doing, leave that behind, don't incorporate it into. So it's not like you're adding to your way of living, you're leaving your way of living, and you're going to live a whole different way. And a lot of Christianity doesn't really get that. Sometimes that's taught on some, but not so much as I think maybe it needs to be. And I think that's an important concept for each of us to keep in mind in our daily lives of what we're doing and how we're living. Are we living according to the precepts that God has instructed us with, that told us how to live in relationship with him 24/7? Or are we just doing things as we've always done them? And I'm guilty of that myself. And so I'm talking to myself here, to remind myself that, I'm not supposed to be the old Doug. He was not a good guy. So we're called to intimacy with God, and through the covenant of Israel. Give me a minute. And so the korbanot, the offerings, they're all about redemption, to redeeming Israel and making atonement and showing God's grace. Because one of the things, or the main thing, that separates us humans from the animal world is we have a spirit and we have a soul. And God breathed the soul into us, and he gave us his spirit, and animals don't. And so, but at the same time, we still have an animal nature, and I think all of us can recognize that animal nature within us, but we're not supposed to live that way. And so the whole purpose of the offerings is to elevate us above that, above the animal nature, and to lift that animal nature up to be more spiritual instead of just animalistic. And that's the whole concept of why they have the korbanot, because animal nature has no spirituality to it. And in fact, because of the different types of offerings, and the prayers said, it elevates all of creation. It doesn't just elevate the people, it elevates everything that God created, the animals, the grains, the fruits, the trees, everything is elevated, and that's all part of tikkun olam, restoring things to the way they should be back when they were originally created. And so there's a very deep purpose to this that I think we can all gain a lot from. Like I say, it's all a picture of God's grace. And a lot of us were taught that the offerings, or probably referred to as sacrifices, that, you have to sacrifice this because you screwed up, or it's going to make God happy, or you're appeasing an angry God because he's just waiting for you to screw up. And that's really a pagan idea. It comes from pagan religion. It doesn't come from Torah. It doesn't come from Judaism. It doesn't come from oral Torah. It just comes from the sinful nature of man who knew nothing about God. And We don't serve an angry God who's ready to just beat you at any time you screw up. We serve a God who loves you and cares about you and just can't wait to show mercy. But we forget that. And we sung about that. And so I think if we keep that in mind when we're reading through this book, we can see to the extent and the detail that he means that. And that's something that I think we really need to keep in mind a lot. Because I forget. And sometimes I'm just convinced that he doesn't love me or doesn't care. But that's just me and my stupidity. So we need to remember to not think of God in that light. And like I said, when a lot of us that were taught in Christianity and maybe other religions too, that they focus on the idea of sacrifices being for sin. And yet, when you read through all 5 of them, there was only one that had to deal with sin. The other 4 had nothing to do with that. So it really wasn't about that. Not even at all. And the one that did have to do with sin, it had to do with unintentional sin, accidental sin. Like, I didn't realize that this was something I shouldn't do, and I screwed up, I'm sorry. And I blew it. And so you go atone for that, and you rectify it, and you make an offering, and you get that restored. And it's not about, and I don't know about you, probably not this crowd, but I'm sure all of the sins that you guys do are unintentional and accidental, but me, probably 0.0008% are unintentional. Pretty much every time I've sinned, I did it full well knowing it was a sin, and I really didn't care because I wanted to do it. Because that's just my sinful nature, the animal nature. But none of these offerings deal with that. And that's something I think a lot of us that had religious teaching from other backgrounds besides Judaism maybe were taught that these had something to do with forgiving sin in general, or intentional sin, or that Jesus died on the cross and his blood forgives you of the intentional sins you did. I don't know about that. I don't see that here. You won't find that from the sages, and you won't find it from Judaism. So I'm not sure where they get that idea. Intentional sin was dealt with yearly on Yom Kippur, and through living a devoted life and doing teshuvah, and doing mitzvot and tzedakah and other things. Judaism has remedies for that, but it's not this. It's something different. So you have to keep that in mind, what you're talking about here. Don't muddy the water and confuse things. And many of us have heard that Yeshua was the final sacrifice for sin. Well, if I'm not mistaken, they continued to do sacrifices for another 40 some odd years while the temple still stood. How was that the final one? It wasn't, obviously. So that's a misnomer. So you want to just kind of forget that. And the idea of the Korban, like I say, it was being the heart of Torah and the sacrifices and the offerings, better word, these are for us. These aren't really for God. We're the ones that get the benefit out of it. We're the ones that get the restoration of the intimacy with him. We're the ones that get the repairing of the things that need to be repaired in us through this process. These are for us. This was God giving us a gift, going, here, this is good for you. Do this. You'll be blessed from it. Not like, you screwed up, you have to go do this now. Completely wrong mindset. And that's not, you won't find that in Judaism. So we have to, some of us, maybe some of you already understood that, but me, that's kind of a whole new concept. I didn't know that about these. That wasn't the way I looked at that. And, when we talk about living, living a separate life, and, before this happened, God took the Israelites out of Egypt. They were living among pagan idolatry, and that's the way they lived. And so he called them out of that and brought them here and said, look, we're going to live a separate life. You're going to be kings and priests to me. You're going to serve me and me alone. I don't want you having, other gods in your life and false gods. That's going to take away from our relationship. And so, if they're called to be a nation of kings and priests to serve God, it's through Judaism. And if you do the research, Judaism is really, it's not just a religion, it's an entire way of life. It's a way of living everything. If you read through the entire Torah and the entire Tanakh, it's not just something you do once a week, like most people think about religion. It's an entire way of life, and it addresses many different aspects of life. How you relate to one another in a congregation, how you relate to your spouse, how do you relate to your boss or your employees, how do you relate to strangers? All of these things are addressed within the concept of Judaism. And it's the only religion, per se, if you want to use that word, but it's more than that. It's the only one that wasn't invented by man. If you do the research, you'll find that out. Every other religion on the planet, man came up with on his own. And that does include Christianity. Now, granted, Christianity does borrow a lot of things from Judaism, but nonetheless, it is a man-made religion. And the majority of it comes from man-made traditions and other religions and practices. Doesn't really focus from Judaism, although it's got parts of it. But Judaism is the only one that you can say is not man-made. God did it, and he said, this is how we're going to live together. These are the rules of the house. So again, it's a call to intimacy with him. Accepting that invitation and that covenant is basically to accept Judaism. Accept living like a Jew. Not living like you were before, whatever that meant. Forsaking the things of your past life. And in my mind, personally, that means forsaking the way I lived before I had any religion or spirituality in my life, forsaking the false ideas that I learned about God and religion, forsaking the false religious beliefs that I got from various sources, Christianity being one of them, and there was others. So it's a call to leave all that behind, not bring it with me and drag it into the tent and pollute the environment. And I think we have to, that's why I think it's so important and why I've addressed the issues of the differences between Christianity and Judaism the last couple of times I've taught, because to me that's a critical issue. And many of us don't really get that. And I don't think that's a good thing if you don't understand that and don't apply that to your life. So you have to, in my mind, you really have to understand the entire book and the entire way of living from a Jewish thought process. And here in the West, we don't think like they do in the East. It's not natural to us. We're brought up with a Hellenistic thinking, and we don't even realize that that's what it is. But the more you study the Jewish culture and the Jewish way of thinking, the more you can recognize the differences. And that's the only way to really understand what this relationship with God and each other is supposed to be all about and how it's supposed to function. Another interesting note is that through the entire book of Leviticus, not just the first 5 chapters, but the entire book, the only word used for God in reference to the offerings is the 4-letter tetragrammaton, Yahweh, or Jehovah, or YHVH, the unpronounceable name because we don't know what it means. Hashem, the name, okay? Interestingly enough, another name that's used for him, Elohim, is not there at all. And the name Yahweh, or Jehovah, is associated with grace. Elohim is associated with judgment and punishment. You don't find that within the book of Leviticus. So nothing about the book of Vayikra has to do with judgment. Yet that's the concept and the mindset that many of us were brought up with, is the way we look at it, that it all had to do about that, and appeasing that, and satisfying that judgment nature of God. But it's not even present. It's not there. You don't even find that name one time in the whole entire book. And so, again, having the correct perception of what this is, what it's telling us, and understanding that nature is, I think, is important. Now, it's interesting that, going back to the idea of intentional sin, within Judaism, there's an idea that Messiah, Ben Yosef, dies for the sins that are intentional, according to Judaism. So that's not a foreign concept to Judaism, that your intentional sins are not just dealt with on Yom Kippur, but Messiah Ben Yosef deals with those. And in Judaism, there's 2 Messiahs. There's Messiah Ben Yosef, Messiah ben David. Or I guess you could say Messiah in 2 visitations. Maybe it's the same Messiah, maybe it's 2 different Messiahs, I don't really know. But regardless, one's referred to as Messiah ben Yosef, which the concept is one who suffers and is treated unjustly, and people hate him, and he wasn't given his due as the messenger of God. And the other is Messiah ben David, which is, I think, what the majority of Judaism focuses on, which is he comes as a reigning king, and he's going to do away with all the sinners, and he's going to get rid of all the false religions, and he's going to punish all the bad people, and he's going to restore the temple, and he's going to bring all the Jews back to Israel, and he's going to make everything whole again. And that's all true, but that's just one aspect of Messiah. There's the whole other aspect. And so I think we need to be aware of that. And I was going to teach on that, but I haven't really, the 2 different Messiahs in Judaism, but I haven't been able to find enough research on that. So maybe another time in the future I'll teach on that from Judaism, because I don't want to rely on Christian sources for that. So I think that's important for us to understand. So God did deal with that through his grace. There is an answer for the intentional sins that we commit. And when you think about the grace of these offerings, it's a chance for a do-over. And over and over and over and over and over and over, countless times, as often as you need it. And you can't get any deeper grace than that. Because many of us, it's like, you do me wrong one time, shame on you. You do me wrong twice, shame on me. Kind of the idea that, I'll only forgive you for doing me wrong a certain number of times, and then after that all bets are off and forget you. And we don't see that here. What we see here is there's endless, continual, unending mercy and grace. However often you need it, for whatever you did, And if you read through, and I would encourage you to do that, read through the entire Parsha. If you haven't on your own, do it this week. And, in chapter 4 and 5, it talks about, well, if the sin was committed by a priest, or if the sin was committed by the entire camp of Israel, or if the sin was committed by one of the leaders, and each one is addressed differently, or if the sin was committed by just one of the members. And so each one has its own place. And I think that's from chapter 4, if I'm not mistaken, the Olah. So, he didn't overlook anything. He dealt with it. And it's the grace is there for you as you need it, when you need it. Now, another interesting thing is that, people wonder, and, many of us still ask the question, well, there isn't any more temple. So they're not making sacrifices. And I've wondered this myself. I thought, well, in my wrong thinking, okay, well, if the Jews get forgiveness from sin from sacrifices and offerings and they're not making them anymore, how are they forgiven? Duh. Wrong question. It wasn't about that. Okay? But since there is no more temple, what do we do now? And there's an answer for that. And this is kind of interesting. Maimonides teaches that God intended for us to progress from animal offerings to prayer, and once we were ready for that transition. But it would have been too much to expect the former slaves, because of what was ingrained in them, and the way they were living, dealing with their masters, for them to accept an invisible God that they couldn't see, and having words alone as a way to connect with God. They couldn't grasp that. It was too much for them to wrap their brains around. So it would have been too far out of their realm of experience. But yet, that he says that was one of the concepts, and he was one of the sages of Judaism. And what they did is they constructed substitutes for these offerings. 3 in particular: prayer, study, and tzedakah, which is giving to the poor and the needy and the widows. And so I think we can all realize that those are ways that all of us can connect to God in an intimate fashion. Through prayer, through studying the Torah and the Tanakh, and through giving to others. That elevates our animal nature to a spiritual level. And we can help elevate the rest of the world by doing so. And so, that's, and they even say that when you study through the book of Vayikra, and you study and you read through the offerings and you pray about them, that it's credited to you as though you did the offering. It's as if you did it within your own soul. So we're getting the same benefit from it. No, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what the sages say. So I'll go with what they know, because they know a lot more than I do about this stuff. And when you think about offerings, we love what we're willing to give and offer gifts for. You generally don't give an offering or a gift to somebody you don't care about, or somebody you hate, or a stranger. You do that for somebody as a gift of appreciation, because you like them, or you love them. They're your spouse or a family member, or or you'll give to a charity because you like what that charity does. You like what they're going to do with the money. And so that's the whole concept of these gifts and these offerings, because they're done because of our love for God. To love is to want to bring an offering to the beloved. To love is to give. Offering gifts is the choreography of love. It's how you It's like people will say, well, don't tell me you love me, show me you love me. Words are cheap. Show me in actions. And that speaks a lot to it. There's people that or one guy who wrote about the 5 love languages, and one of them is words of affirmation and this and that. Another one is gift giving. Another one is acts of service. And, the other 4 are physical doings. Show me you love me by your actions, and I don't really care if you say the words. And that proves that you love me, and that's what this is. That's the whole concept here, is the people were showing their love to God through these different offerings that he graciously extended to them as an opportunity to come to him, which he didn't have to do. So at the beating heart of Judaism is love, the Shema. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and ganas, with everything you have. That's the whole gist of the Judaism, is love God. Learn to love him and express that love in the way that he wants us to. Another thing that I think many of us have heard about the offerings or sacrifices is that was a way for Israel to get saved, per se. Or a lot of people equate having sins forgiven as being saved, that the 2 terms are synonymous, which I don't agree with that, but a lot of people think that. And a lot of people have been taught that. And like I said, the whole idea of the sacrifice being all about sin, we already see that it's not. It's way bigger than that. So think about this. It was the Jews who were doing the offerings, and the Jews already had a covenant with God. They already had a relationship with him. They were already saved. Hello? You get that? It wasn't something they did to get in covenant. It wasn't something they did to keep the covenant or restore it if they broke it. It wasn't something they did to get a relationship with God. They already had that. It had nothing to do with that. The Jews didn't do Torah to be saved. They didn't do the law to be saved. They were already saved. They were already in covenant. They were already God's chosen people. And that isn't really a concept that I understood before I started studying on this week for this teaching. I mean, I kind of knew it, but it hadn't quite clicked. The lights hadn't fully come on yet. And then it was like, oh yeah, that's right. Duh. I mean, these were saved people doing these offerings. It was an outworking of them being saved, in essence, when you think about it. Like, I think it was, James or Jacob or whatever his name is in the New Testament, he says, you say faith without works is dead. Well, I'll prove to you my faith because I do these things. That's the whole idea here, And I think that's an important thing. So the whole thinking is of doing things under the law to get saved is contrary to the concept of Torah. It's a foreign concept. And it's the other thing about the concept of salvation or being saved in Judaism is predominantly the idea and the concept is that's a gift from God through his grace to the nation as a whole, not individually, you and you and you and you, but not you and not you. So that, again, that's a different concept of being saved and salvation than most of us have heard about from other places and other backgrounds. So it's, they're all saved because they're all in covenant. The entire nation, every person. Okay? Well, now what about the Gentiles? Because this was a mixed multitude, remember. Out of Egypt didn't come just Jews. A lot of Gentiles came with them. And the concept of allowing Gentiles to be grafted in, per se, into Israel isn't just a New Testament concept. It isn't just a concept from since Yeshua came, when the Messiah. It's been among the whole Tanakh from way back. The Jews have always allowed Gentiles to come into the camp and live among them and live as them. And that's important. They weren't living as pagan Gentiles within the camp of Israel. They were living as Jews. So in essence, they were grafted in. They were included as a part of Israel. And so this applies to Gentiles too, in terms of the offerings. Because, okay, well, it was Jews doing the offerings. Well, the Gentiles in the camp, the ones that were allowed in and wanted to be a part of that invitation was open to them as well. It was to everybody. So that applies to us as Gentiles if we don't have Jewish background and Jewish blood. The same invitation. Come live within Judaism to have your salvation and your covenant relationship with God. And, there's a concept in Judaism that you get born again and you get from the mikveh. And you die and you raise up a new creation and you have a new life. The whole concept of born again isn't a New Testament concept. It's not a Christian concept. It's a Jewish concept. And I researched onto that a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And so this is for everybody. The offerings, it had nothing to do with getting saved or staying in covenant or, and again, we have to remember that the Torah, the oral Torah, was around since way before, since the very beginning. And so it's not new. So these Jews, in essence, were already saved, and they already had a covenant. And so the term, having a covenant with God and being saved are somewhat synonymous. And I would also say the term being born again. I don't think you can have one without the other two, or have two without the third one. And if you have one, you have all three. So the way my mind works, and this is all from Jewish concepts and Jewish sages and Jewish rabbis and Orthodox, and some of them don't even believe in Yeshua the Messiah, and I don't really care. It's a Jewish thought process, and that's where I want to go for my information, because these are the guys that know, and they've been doing it for thousands of years. And they're in their understanding, and I was listening to a guy, an Orthodox rabbi this week on this teaching on this Parsha, and it's like, if you're born again into Judaism. And in my mind, I immediately went, well then, can you be born again into Christianity? Well, I don't know about the answer to that one. I know what my answer is, but I'm not sure I'm right, so I'm not going to touch that one. But I think it's something to think about. If the Jewish concept of being born again means to be born again into Judaism as part of Israel, I think I'll lean towards that understanding, because I don't see how that would have changed over the years, or how anything in the entire book would have discounted that or changed that. If that's what it meant to them, I think that's what it should mean to me. So I'm very grateful and I'm very thankful that I, as a wickedly sinful Gentile, and I don't say that lightly, I say that sincerely, if you would have known about my background, have been given the opportunity to elevate my soul and to have a spiritual aspect to my life and to come to know the creator of the entire universe. I don't take that lightly. That's a very deep thing to me. And so, following the Torah isn't required to be in the covenant. It's something that you do because you're in the covenant and you're appreciative of it and you want to do it the way it should be done because that's the picture it's going to paint the right thing into your soul. When you think of it wrongly, you're going to get the wrong picture and you're going to get the wrong idea. So, the salvation and the covenant relationship and being born again, it's all the same from a Jewish perspective. And I have to get that in my brain and in my heart. And as we mentioned about these things, and from the Jewish perspective, the three elements, which are evidence of salvation or being born again or having the covenant relationship with God, the fruit, as it were, that you'll see that's born from this, as the New Testament refers to the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, blah, 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 goes on and on. But our teshuvah, repentance, turning back from the wrong path, going to the right path, correcting your life. Tzedakah and mitzvot, doing good deeds and giving to those in need. That comes from teshuvah and kanavah and tefillah, a life of devotion and a life of prayer. Devotion, studying the Torah, studying the Tanakh, and praying on a regular basis. The Jews have a daily prayer book that has a whole list of prayers that are prayed every single day. And in some communities, there's people that go to the synagogue and the temple every day and pray those. They have daily service. I don't know if they do that here at the synagogue and the temple. They might. There might be some people that do that daily. I go through the daily prayer book on my own at my house. I have a copy of it. I can't say I do it every day. Some days I miss. But I try to do it every day and go through those prayers. And it helps keep me centered. It helps keep me reminded because I'm a stupid human and I forget. And I need to be reminded and reminded and reminded and reminded again. And it keeps me humble. It reminds me that, my place in relationship to God, in relationship to Israel. So, and if you think about, Yeshua he taught a lot in parables, and, one of them was about a good tree and a bad tree. And can a bad tree produce good fruit? No. And can a good tree produce bad fruit? No. And trees are a picture of people. And so I equate that to, if you're a good tree and you're born again and you're in covenant and you've been saved, and again, salvation is there's a present tense concept and there's a future tense concept. It's not a once and done kind of a thing. We're all going to be, all those that are part of Israel are going to be saved from all of the wrath that's going to destroy the world in the future and later when it comes. So there's a salvation that's still yet to come, and there's already been some salvation. I've already been saved from a lot of things that should have taken me off the planet already, and I should have been died and killed many times over. And I haven't been, I'm still here. I don't know why, but I'm still trying to figure that out. But anyway, so, there's, I don't know where I was going with that. But, that's part of our covenant with him is being saved and then having that salvation from him in that. And so, if I'm a good tree, if I'm a man that's been saved and in covenant and been born again, I should be producing good fruit. I should be doing teshuvah. I should be doing tzedakah and mitzvot. I should be committing myself to kanavah and studying the word. I should be doing tefillah and praying. These are the good fruits that are born from having the right corrected soul. Now, obviously, our souls aren't fully corrected. That needs to be happening all the time. But I've got a lit spirit now. My spirit's alive. It's not dead. I understand some spiritual things that I didn't have a clue about before. So now these things should be the result of that. And, a lot of the parables you'll see in the New Testament are about that. It's like, well, if in fact you are saved and are in covenant with God, then this is how you should be living, and that should look like Judaism. It shouldn't look like whatever other religion you came from before. It shouldn't look like your life before you had any religion. It should look like living a Jewish lifestyle, inclusive of all of that. However much of that you want to incorporate into your life, the more blessed you'll be. Another interesting thing about the offerings is that the fat and the blood were reserved for God. Those are for him, not for the people. And that also relates to the kashrut and the kosher laws. To have an animal killed and be kosher, it's got to be killed a certain way and all the blood drained from it, because the life is in the blood. And you're not to eat blood. You're not to have that. Demons do that. We don't. And I don't want to be doing things that demons do. I don't necessarily always buy meat that was killed kosher, but at least I buy meat that's from clean and considered kosher animals. So, but I don't eat blood. But there's an element of that we need to also pay attention to. There's an aspect of that that's important for us. The sages also say that if you really want to understand the Torah and get the full concepts and understanding that it has, you have to be eating kosher and keeping kosher. And I think where that comes from is if you eat unclean animals that are unkosher, you're taking into your soul the animalistic nature and the sinful, evil nature of those, and it becomes a part of your soul. You're polluting the water. I don't want to do that. Now, I'm sure I do from time to time, from different things I do in my life, but I want to try to get better at not doing it at all. Not just from, the kashrut and kosher food. And so, in essence, you could say that kosher food is soul food. And it isn't really that, you can't eat that. It's not about that. It's about, is this food going to benefit your soul? And I think that's an aspect that a lot of people miss or don't even think about when it comes to kosher food. And rabbis talked about, many things when it comes to kosher food and clean or kosher animals, that it isn't about, eating a healthy diet. I mean, yes, there are health benefits to it, but that's not really what it was about. There's a spiritual aspect, and they represent, there's a picture form that we can learn from, the nature of this animal, the nature of that animal. And all the animals were brought to Adam, and he named them all because he understood their natures. And so we need to learn from that and go, okay, there's a nature to these certain unclean animals that we should avoid, and what's the lesson from there? What's it speaking to us, And again, it's not just, don't eat pigs because they're unhealthy, and don't eat shrimp because they're sea cockroaches, and they eat garbage. It's not about that. So there's a spiritual aspect to the offerings and the food and what's kosher and what isn't, and studying Torah, and imbuing the animalistic nature of things into our soul. You know, we're supposed to be elevating our soul and feeding our spirit, not giving into that. And one of the rabbis, he said that's why we don't eat predatory animals, because they hunt and they kill for food and just to kill. Sometimes predatory animals kill other animals and don't even eat them. They just leave them. I mean, that's an animalistic nature, you know, and those are unkosher animals that do that, and that dilutes our spirituality, and it dilutes our understanding of Torah, and I don't want that diluted. I want to keep my heart and my soul clean. I want to keep it strong. I want to keep it devoted out of my love for God as much as I can. As flawed as I am, I want to focus on that. So that's some of the stuff that I got from this week from studying through the Parsha. It was a whole lot more, and I could have been here all day, but anyway, that's some of the things that I got. As I said, I would encourage each of you to read through the Parsha yourself, do some studying on your own if you haven't already. One of the resources that I really, really like, was a good investment, was a Humash. This is an interlinear Humash from Schottenstein. It has the Hebrew and the English, and English is right below the Hebrew, so you can help learn yourself from Hebrew while you're reading it. You can see which word is which. And it's also got a lot of footnotes from the sages and the rabbis. So it's got this one, it does have the vowels and the cannellation points. It does, as you were talking about, Chris. But this isn't considered a Torah because it's not a scroll. A Humash is a written, bound Torah, and it is just the 5 books. It's not the entire Tanakh. I'm sorry?
So it's the 5 books with the vowels? Yes. It's the 5 books with vowels?
Yes.
Okay.
But like I said, it's also got the study notes. Like on these pages, this is the Torah reading. These are all study notes from the rabbis and the sages. So it's got a lot, again, you can see it's full of a lot of resource material from the commentaries that go back centuries and thousands of years from those that know way more than we do. Now, I mean, there's a lot of different versions of the Humash you can get. They're not all interlinear. I like it because it helps me learn Hebrew. There's Art Scroll one, there's the Schottenstein one, there's others. You can find them online. And this one, again, this is a single volume. Schottenstein also makes one that's 5 volumes. And so there's obviously, it's going to have a whole lot more notes and research material. But this one was like $65. That other one's $170, and I couldn't afford it. So at some point, I'd like to get a 5-volume set. But I would encourage you to at least get one from somewhere. At least get a single volume if you can. And it's good Jewish-based research in terms of understanding the text. We've all seen the study Bibles that have a lot of footnotes in the sides. It's the same concept. That's where they got that idea from these. This has been around for years. So get you a Humash and use that for your study. I would encourage you to. Okay? You had a question? Okay. So, that's what I have for today. If there's any questions, that's fine. I can answer them now, or you can ask them later. If not, let's stand for the Alenu. Alenu לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו משפחת האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו הקם, וגורלנו kekol hamonam. Let us adore the Lord of all, who in greatness created the world from of old, that he has not made us like the nations of the earth, not made us like the families of the land. He has not made our destiny like theirs, or cast our lot with all of them. V'ne'emar v'chaya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz b'yom hahu yeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad. And it is said, the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day the Lord shall be one, and his name one. Ve'anahu korim u'shmitachavim u'modim ufnei melech malchei chamlachim hakadosh baruch hu. And we bend the knee and bow in worship and give thanks to the King of Kings, the Holy One. Blessed is he. We acknowledge before the King of Kings that there is none like him. There is nothing but him. As Torah says, know that the Lord, he is God, in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Ein od, there is nothing else but God. Do we have Kiddush? Great, let's do that.